Let's review what myths are by summarizing a lot of what we have discussed and presented already in some of these videos. We'll look at the definitions again and build our arguments toward what current and future myth looks like. In the Crash Course World Mythology series on YouTube, their first episode gives a meaningful definition of myth. They say that myth is a story that has both significance, which means that it's important or describes a significant aspect of cosmology, and staying power. So it has been around for centuries or has the potential to stick around in our future memories. If we remind ourselves of Lincoln's definitions, we can also add that myths are significant because they are credible and they have authority as transcendent truths. Lincoln traces mythos as having those same authority and truth claims. But from Plato and the early church fathers, Lincoln documents the deconstruction of the term mythos, reducing its significance to nothing more than lies. And then Lincoln traces mythos replacement with logos, or reason and science, as the truth. That development today gives us the concept of logos as being the only truth in postmodernity, now replacing even faith and reason as traditionally known in medieval times. We see that discussed also further in Harari's Homo Deus book. So focusing on Lincoln, myths are that small class of stories, not a huge number of stories, but a small class that has credibility and authority. Myth serves as a paradigm for a people, a model of thinking, and can be used to motivate the group, as it is a social thinking mechanism. Myths evoke sentiments so they can prove to motivate. If we say, remember the Alamo, we evoke the mythic legend of fighting to the death carried in the image of the fort in San Antonio being destroyed by Mexican forces. Gen Z is not familiar with this slogan, but just watch the movies that were made about it to understand this as a revolutionary slogan. So putting that all together, we get that myths have certain qualities. They have significance, credibility, authority, and staying power because of the first three. This might be a compositional definition of myth. For all myths, in order to be myths, should have these interrelated elements, guaranteeing their provenance or promulgation, their perdurance over a long period of time. We've already discussed in other videos the development of mythos from authoritative speech to lies with logos replacing it. Mythos is a call to identity, establishing group belonging in an evocation of the sentiment associated with the story, resulting in Nazi or Spanish genocide, as we have seen in Lincoln and Todorov readings, respectively. Today, myth has many different definitions and meaning. What is a contemporary way of reading myths? Taking Crash Course World Mythology, episode 12, into account, we see how that series traces the development of myth, much like Lincoln through the devolution of mythos as a concept to lies and falsehoods that Plato gives it. Episode 12 also traces the Volk creations of Herder and Malinowski in treating certain mythic beliefs as being primitive and others establishing a superior form of stories, more sophisticated, especially because they are our stories. Myths have psychological effects as well, with Freud in the unconscious and with Jung in the collective unconscious, which Campbell then picks up and creates the monomyth of the hero's journey. And finally, episode 12 cites Doty's definition, which adds to our discussion here, focusing on the subjects that myths focus on, namely the social, the psychological, the literary, textual and performative, the structural, and finally, the political. And of course, David Leeming focuses on defining myths as regards its subject, stories of gods, heroes, and so forth. Leeming names modern-day myth makers to be the poets, writers, and scientists of modernity. All confront the grand mysteries of life, where the science and the story, the factual and the mythic complement each other. After all, science doesn't ask the meaning of the thing or the why. This alludes to the functions of myth that Campbell gives us, including the psychosocial function. So as Campbell says, myths serve a variety of functions: mystical, cosmological, social, and pedagogical, as compared to Doty, who adds the psychological, the literary, the textual and performative, the structural and political functions. This gives a more complete functional definition of myth, kind of like a grammar of myth. We have the composite elemental definition of myth, which says that myths consist of these elements: significance, staying power, and so forth. We have another elemental definition that talks about the subject of myths as gods, heroes, places, and so forth in a variety of functions. And the functional definition of myth, which gets at why myths are and what they are there to do. Not the least function of which is to build and maintain the imaginary of the group and its power or hegemony. Here's the evolution of my own definition of myth. It adheres to Bruce Lincoln's basic definition as a form of narrative discourse that contains deeply ingrained and distinctive signs and symbols that are there to communicate and help us interpret or reinterpret human life and life itself. When evoked, these myths act as motivators that lead to predictable behaviors, like remember the Alamo slogan, which is to say they build society and culture while belonging to the canon of stories that everyone knows and can call upon or manipulate to get others to do what they want. If you missed any of these definitions, take a look here at some of the links to get a better sense of any one perspective.